Okay, what this is a ecological succession primer based on Harvard Forest Dioramas. I did have their permission to do this, and I'm this fella here. So often, and I would use this when I taught ecology in high school and environmental science, that when the original settlers came to the United States back in the 15 and 1600s there, in New England, what did they find? Well, in many cases, there were forests. And of course, the Indians were living there, and the Indians lived in harmony with the forest. And what kind of trees did you have, you might ask? Well, they had softwoods, the pine trees and things. Then they had a number of species of hardwoods. So we call this type of forest a mixed deciduous forest, and it was a forest throughout New England in which they had, in many cases, the four seasons. The hardwood trees would lose their leaves, and the softwood trees would lose some of their needles, but kept a lot of them. So, what did the early colonists do? Well, they often cut down the trees and they took the stones that were left by the glaciers, often referred to as glacial erratics, and made fences out of these stones that they collected. They plowed the fields and built a little house and raised crops. Now, they didn't cut down all the trees. That was one of the things. They often left pine trees, spruce trees, the evergreens present. They liked a little color in there. And then through time, they cut down more trees, used it to develop more acreage for growing crops and grazing cattle. And this was very typical of farmlands in New England. But again, they kept the hedgerows, as you can see over here, and these were evergreens. Now, as time went on, and this is just a little close-up of the diorama, so typical of New England. The farmhouse would be on one side of the road, the barn on the other, and there was the road passing through, and the stone walls. In fact, we went on field trips to many of these areas, and still in some places you could see the old stone walls. It had returned to forest, as we'll tell you as we continue our little program here. But what often happened is the soil lost its productivity. And what was happening in the West? Well, new lands were opening and colonists were moving on to Indiana and central part of the states where the planting was really good there, good soil. And what did they do with their farmlands? Well, they abandoned the farmlands. And that's what this illustration is shown. And what happens when you have abandoned farmlands? Well, the pine trees here, particularly as they have their cones, which are the seed vehicle, the seeds of the pine trees were spread around, and with little competition, these seedlings just grew, and many areas of abandoned farmlands throughout New England went to pine trees, softwood trees. And that's what they're illustrating here. There might have been some shrubs first, and then the pine trees, again, without competition, took over. And then through time, this abandoned fields, uh, the pine trees grew quite well. Didn't have a lot of competition from anything else, and it went to conifer forest. And there are still some places where conifer forests are present in New England as part of this succession that we see here. And then what did they do? Well, as the pine trees grew and matured, lumber industry developed, and what they did is they cut down this. And we see the lumberjacks here working and sawing up the trees that they've cut. There was a sawmill. This was probably late 1800s, early 1900s by this time. And what the farmer thought, or the lumber people who own this land thought, they could just keep on harvesting these pine trees because they thought that pine trees were what we might think of in ecological terms the climax, what it ends up being. Now, when they left it to be replanted by the pine trees, it wasn't so easy because by this time hardwoods were coming in there. And instead of the natural from abandoned farmland, which were plowed, now some of the hardwoods were starting to get in there, and hardwoods were taken over. So the person who was relying on this to be naturally seeded by evergreen trees, softwood trees, they found that they were getting a mixture now of hardwoods and softwoods. So what was going on? Well, interestingly, it was going back to what it was before, which was a mixed deciduous forest, typical of a middle latitude deciduous forest. This is what is climax, what they had found, and in many cases, when you walk through, this is a current photograph of a typical forest. You notice there are some pine trees still, but often many species of hardwoods. So as a sort of a summary then is what we saw here was a modified ecological succession and is often referred to as secondary succession because it was a succession from abandoned farm fields. Now in primary succession, just to review the term a little bit, you start with rock that slowly breaks down and you accumulate a rock powder. And then to that you add lichens and other organic material, mosses. And in fact, I'm going to do another video where I've illustrated that. And then through time you get some soil. And then the first thing to happen to this new soil now is you get grasses. Grasses are annuals. They die off, but as they die, they add more organic material. So the presence of grasses and other species that are your primary, your pioneer ecological organisms there in terms of succession, they're replaced because they make it better for other things to move in. And this is what we have. And Often what you find in an area is determined, again through time, the climate. Climate's one of the major factors. Okay, so about 10 minutes, a little primer on New England middle latitude deciduous forest. So back to my biology days.